He delivered a package. He accidentally saw what she'd spent a decade hiding, and that one mistake changed both their lives forever. If you've ever had a single moment flip your entire life upside down, stay with me until the end of this story. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The storm hit the city at exactly 7:43 in the evening, and Landon Pierce was already 40 minutes behind schedule with 3 deliveries still in his bag and a voicemail from his daughter's school sitting unopened on his phone. He drove with the window cracked despite the rain because the defroster on his 2009 Civic had stopped working sometime in March, and he hadn't had the money or the time to fix it. Water droplets kept catching on his eyelashes. The wipers smeared more than they cleared. The GPS on his phone, propped against the cup holder with a rubber band looped around the vent, kept rerouting him because the address for the last delivery didn't match any street name in the city's standard database. He almost skipped it. That was the thing he'd think about later, in the quiet hours after his daughter fell asleep and the apartment settled around him like something exhaling. He'd been 2 seconds from marking it undeliverable and heading home. The package was light, maybe 4 pounds, wrapped in plain brown paper with a wax seal he'd never seen on a delivery before. And the address read simply, 14 Ashford Way, Northridge Estate. No apartment number, no buzzer code, no contact name beyond a single initial, N. But the surcharge attached to that delivery was $180. $180 for a single drop-off, on top of his regular rate. That was almost what he made in a full 8-hour shift during a slow week. His daughter Mara had a follow-up appointment at the pediatric specialist on Thursday, and the copay alone was going to run him $95 before whatever they decided to order next. So he drove. The road that led to 14 Ashford Way wasn't on any of the delivery maps he usually used. He found it by switching to satellite view and physically tracing the ridgeline north of the city until he spotted a private access lane cutting through a wall of black oak trees. The gate at the entrance was wrought iron, maybe 14 feet tall, with a security panel mounted on a stone pillar that looked like it had been carved rather than built. Landon rolled down his window fully and let the rain come in while he punched the intercom. Static. Then a woman's voice, clipped and professional. "Delivery?" "Yes, ma'am. Landon Pierce, from Meridian Express. I've got a package for..." He glanced at the label. "The N. Ashford Residence." A pause. "Drive to the main entrance. Someone will meet you." The gate swung open without another word. The driveway was a quarter-mile of wet gravel flanked by mature oaks whose branches had grown together overhead into something close to a tunnel. Landon's headlights caught the rain coming down through the gaps in the canopy, and for a moment it looked like driving through static. The house, mansion, really, though that word felt small once he actually saw it, materialized at the end of the lane like something assembled from a different century. Stone facade, dark wood trim, 3 visible floors with a 4th-floor turret that had no lights on. Every window on the 2nd floor was lit from within. Ground floor was mostly dark, except for a single yellow lamp burning behind what looked like a library window. He parked in the turning circle by the front steps. A man in a gray uniform came out under an umbrella. Not young, maybe late 50s, with the careful, neutral expression of someone who'd spent decades working in a house where discretion was its own job requirement. He looked at the package in Landon's hand and then at Landon himself with the particular assessment that said, "Service entrance is around back." "The delivery for Ms. Ashford," the man said. "That's right. Follow me, please." He didn't offer the umbrella. Landon tucked the package under his jacket and followed him up the stone steps and through the main door, which the man held open with one hand while somehow simultaneously folding the umbrella with the other in a motion that looked practiced over years. Inside, the entrance hall was larger than Landon's entire apartment. Marble floor, a staircase splitting left and right at the landing. One large painting of a coastline hung above a console table bearing a vase of flowers that had probably cost more than his car. The man, whose name tag read Gerald in small silver letters, set the umbrella in a stand near the door and turned back to Landon. "Ms. Ashford's personal items are received in the East Wing. If you'll follow..." His phone rang. Gerald held up one finger, the reflex of someone whose employer expected immediate response, and turned away, already moving toward the far end of the hall, already pulling the device from his inner pocket, already answering in the low murmur of someone trying not to disturb the ambient silence of a large and well-maintained house. Landon stood in the entrance hall. He waited approximately 30 seconds, holding the package, dripping slightly on the marble floor, listening to Gerald's one-sided conversation somewhere around the corner. The words weren't audible, just the rhythm. Question, pause, answer, longer pause. He looked at the staircase. He had the delivery slip in his other hand and the handwritten note clipped to it, apparently added during sorting at the dispatch centers, from said East Wing, 2nd floor, 3rd door. Gerald had been leading him somewhere in that direction before the phone call interrupted. The package under Landon's jacket was getting damp from his wet jacket. The wax seal would hold, probably, but the brown paper was already softening at the edges. He made a decision that was not, in retrospect, the smartest decision of his life. He took the stairs. 2nd floor. Carpeted hallway running left, running right. He went right because the east wing would logically face the direction the sun rose, and the right side of the house, when he'd driven up, had caught what little was left of the evening light. 3rd door. He counted. 1st door closed, light underneath. 2nd door, open, dark inside. 3rd door closed, no light visible at the bottom. He raised his hand to knock, and that was when he realized the door wasn't fully latched. The frame had shifted in this old house. Warped wood, slightly imperfect fit. And the door rested against the jamb without actually catching. His knuckle barely grazed the wood before it swung inward, maybe 4 inches, maybe 6, enough to break the seal of the room, enough to see. He saw her in the mirror first. That was the thing. She was standing with her back partially turned, facing a tall antique mirror propped against the far wall, and she was in the process of pulling a silk robe from her shoulders, and her back was turned enough that she hadn't seen the door move. Landon Pierce was not the kind of man who stood in doorways watching. He pulled the door back, started to pull it all the way shut again, but the warped frame caught, the same warped frame that had let it swing open, and the door stuck, not open, not closed, holding at that 4-inch gap, and his hand was on the doorknob at an awkward angle, and he was trying to pull it flush without making noise, and he spent approximately 2 seconds too long doing that. 2 seconds was enough, because in those 2 seconds he saw something he wasn't supposed to see. Not what a stranger might assume, not the obvious embarrassment of the moment, but something more specific, something that registered in the clean, observational part of his brain before the social and self-preserving parts had time to intervene. The skin of her upper back and right side carried the particular topography of old surgical scarring. Not 1, not 2, but multiple procedures, each healed to a slightly different shade, some thin and precise, some wider. All of them old enough to have silvered but recent enough in their layering to suggest a history that was still ongoing. And near her right ribs, faintly visible above the waistband of what she was changing out of, a medical patch. The kind with a readout on it. The kind Landon had seen before, on a different person, in a different context years ago. His brain cataloged this in the time it takes to blink twice. Then he heard the sharp intake of breath and looked up from where he'd been involuntarily looking and found her eyes in the mirror looking directly back at him. The silence lasted about 1 full second. Then Natalie Ashford turned around. She didn't scream. She didn't reach for anything. She just turned, and she looked at him, and her face went through approximately 4 distinct expressions in the span of 3 seconds. Surprise, fury, calculation, something harder and more controlled than any of them. And then she said, in a voice that was very quiet and very precise, "Get out of my house." Landon Pierce had grown up in a city that didn't forgive mistakes easily. He'd learned early that you made your apologies fast. You kept them brief. And you didn't argue with people who had more power than you, because arguing with people who had more power than you only made the consequences worse. His mother had taught him that. 3 different landlords had reinforced it. 2 bosses before the delivery job had cemented it. He set the package on the floor of the hallway, just outside the door, and he said, "I'm sorry. I knocked. The door wasn't latched. I'm leaving." And he left. He went back down the stairs faster than he'd gone up. Gerald was still somewhere to the left, still on the phone, and Landon didn't wait for him. He went through the front door, pulled it behind him, walked to his car in the rain without running because running felt worse than walking. and he sat in the driver's seat for a moment with both hands on the wheel and water dripping from his hair onto his collar. Then he drove home. The apartment was on the third floor of a building that had last been renovated sometime before Landon was born, with pipes that knocked in the cold and a front door that stuck in the summer, and a super who responded to maintenance requests with the enthusiasm of someone being asked to perform minor surgery on themselves. Landon had lived there for 2 years and 11 months. He knew which floorboards to avoid, so he didn't wake Mara when he came in late. She was asleep when he got home. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment. She was 7, small for her age, hair fanned across the pillow in the specific chaos that children achieve without effort. And he listened to her breathe and let the normalcy of it quiet whatever was running too fast inside him. His neighbor, Mrs. Okafor, had been sitting with her. She was in the kitchen when Landon came in, drinking tea and reading on her tablet, and she looked up over her reading glasses and said, "She ate. She did her reading for school. She asked me twice where you were. Sorry I'm late. The roads. You don't have to explain yourself to me, baby." Mrs. Okafor stood, unhurried, setting her tea down. "She asked me to leave the lamp on. I'll turn it off when I check on her." She said, "Don't." He smiled a little, despite everything. "Okay." After Mrs. Okafor left, he made himself a bowl of cereal because there was nothing in the refrigerator that required actual cooking, and he was too tired to think about it. And he stood at the kitchen counter and ate it and tried not to think about what had happened at the mansion on North Ridge. But his mind kept snagging on it, not on the embarrassment of it, though that was there too, a dull heat across the back of his neck every time he replayed that moment in the mirror, but on the other thing, the thing he'd seen that he wasn't supposed to see. Landon Pierce was 32 years old, and he had been, at various points in his life, a lot of different things. He'd done 2 years of a nursing program before the money ran out. He'd worked a year as a home health aide before his certification lapsed, and the agency restructured and the job evaporated. He'd done a stint in dispatch at a medical transport company where part of the job was understanding what equipment meant and why it mattered. He knew what a continuous monitoring patch looked like on a patient with a cardiac arrhythmia. He knew what that particular pattern of surgical scarring suggested about someone's history with the inside of a hospital. He was not a doctor. He was a delivery driver. He'd been very clear with himself about not reading into things he'd seen for 2 seconds through an accidentally open door in a stranger's house. But he also wasn't stupid. Natalie Ashford was 30 years old. She ran Ashford Capital Group, which was one of those companies that showed up in the financial news often enough that even people who didn't follow financial news knew the name. He'd seen her face in a magazine at the pediatric clinic once. One of those business profiles with a photo of her at a conference table looking like she was about 22 and owned the room, the building, and possibly the block. Youngest female CEO in the top 50, the headline had said. No signs of slowing down. He thought about the patch near her ribs and finished his cereal and washed the bowl. Then he went to bed and told himself very firmly that this was not his business, and that the best possible outcome was that her security team had already flagged his delivery ID and he'd be quietly removed from any routes within 50 miles of North Ridge, and that would be the end of it. He told himself that. He mostly believed it. Well, the next morning was a Thursday. Mara had school at 8, which meant she needed to be dressed and fed and out the door by 7:30, which meant Landon was up at 6:15, which was earlier than his first pickup of the day by a full hour, which was fine because it gave him time to pack her lunch and sign the permission slip for the field trip that had been sitting on the kitchen table for 4 days. "Can I have the crackers with cheese in them?" Mara asked, standing at the refrigerator in her pajama pants and a shirt that had a faded print of a cartoon rabbit on it. She was holding the refrigerator door open with both hands and surveying its contents with the focus of someone assessing inventory. "Crackers are in the cabinet." "I know where the crackers are. Can I have them?" "That's a question. It needs a Can I have them?" She looked at him over her shoulder with his own eyes, the same specific shade of gray-green, in a face that otherwise looked like her mother's. "Yeah, take the whole pack." She took the whole pack and sat down at the table and began methodically separating the crackers from the cheese filling, eating them in the wrong order, which she had done since she was 4 and which he had long ago given up trying to understand. "Mrs. Okafor says you came home wet last night." "It was raining." "She says you looked like you drove through a lake." The defroster's broken. Mara considered this. Is it expensive to fix? Not terrible. Okay. She ate a cracker. Are you working today? Yeah. After school? I've got pickups until 6. Mrs. Okafor's getting you from school. She lets me watch the cooking show. I know. The one where they compete. I know, Mar. She was quiet for a moment, eating crackers, and Landon made her sandwich and put it in the bag alongside an apple in a juice box. And the morning moved around them the way mornings did. Ordinary and a little rushed, and just barely enough. He dropped her at school at 7:28, watched her go up the steps with her backpack bouncing, and then sat in the pickup line for a moment after she disappeared through the door. The specialist appointment was Tuesday. He'd already moved 2 delivery windows around to make it work. The last specialist, the pediatric cardiologist they'd seen in February, had used the phrase watchful waiting about 6 times, which was a phrase Landon had learned to translate as nothing is wrong enough to act on yet, but don't stop paying attention. Mara's heart had a structural irregularity that was either going to correct itself or wasn't. So far, it was in the process of either correcting or not. He pulled out of the school lot and merged onto the main road and went to work. The dispatch system had him running 3 industrial pickups on the south side in the morning and a cluster of residential deliveries on the north end in the afternoon. He didn't think about the mansion. He thought about the route, about a turn he took too wide and nearly caught a cyclist, about the fact that his back left tire was making a sound he didn't like when he went over certain kinds of pavement, about whether he could extend Mara's school lunch account, or whether that was going to require a conversation with the front office. At 2:17 in the afternoon, between his 4th and 5th residential drops, his personal phone buzzed with an unknown number. He ignored it. It buzzed again at 2:31. Same number. He picked up on the second ring. Hello? Mr. Pierce. A woman's voice, professional, unhurried. My name is Claire Voss. I'm the executive assistant to Ms. Natalie Ashford. Ms. Ashford would like to arrange a meeting with you at your earliest availability. Landon sat with the phone to his ear and said nothing for approximately 3 seconds. Mr. Pierce? Yeah. He cleared his throat. I'm here. Ms. Ashford is available tomorrow evening, Friday at 7 p.m. or Saturday morning at 9 a.m. Would either of those times... What kind of meeting? A slight pause. Ms. Ashford would prefer to explain the nature of the meeting in person. Is this a legal thing? I'm not in a position to characterize. I need to know if I need a lawyer. Another pause, longer this time. Then, with something that wasn't quite warmth but was at least the shadow of it, Ms. Ashford's instructions to me were to tell you specifically that this is not a legal matter and that you are not at risk of any action from her office. She asked me to convey that directly. Landon looked out the windshield at the street in front of him. A kid on a bike. A dog tied to a parking meter outside a dry cleaner. The ordinary, unremarkable texture of a Thursday afternoon. Saturday morning, he said. 9. I'll send the address to this number. There will be a visitor pass at the gate. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Pierce. She hung up. Landon set his phone back in the cup holder and sat for a moment. Then he picked up his work phone and checked his route. 3 more drops. He put the car in drive and went back to work. Awesome. He didn't tell anyone about the meeting. He didn't have many people to tell, honestly. Mrs. Okafor, who would worry, and his friend Darius, who drove long haul and was currently somewhere in Nevada, and his mother, who would ask questions until she got to the bottom of it and then continue asking questions after that. He kept it to himself, which was not unusual for him. He was a person who processed things privately, in the small hours of the night, in the silences between tasks. Friday passed. He worked, picked up Mara, made dinner, helped with homework about animals that hibernate, went to bed. Saturday morning, he told Mara he had an errand and that Mrs. Okafor would make her breakfast, and Mara was 7 and therefore entirely preoccupied with the continuation of the cooking competition show she'd been watching and did not press him for details. He got to the address at 8:52. It wasn't the mansion. It was an office building in the financial district, glass and steel, quiet on a Saturday morning, a security desk in the lobby staffed by one guard who looked at his ID and handed him a visitor badge and directed him to the elevator without any commentary. 14th floor. The 14th floor was mostly dark, except for a conference room at the far end, visible through glass walls, where two lights burned and two figures sat, one at the table, one standing near the window. The woman standing near the window turned when the elevator opened. Natalie Ashford looked, in daylight and business clothes, almost nothing like what he'd seen 2 nights ago. Almost. She was in a charcoal blazer and dark pants, her hair pulled back, a coffee cup on the table in front of where she'd apparently been sitting. She was not, as he'd half-consciously expected, looking at him the way you'd look at someone you were about to destroy. She was looking at him the way you look at a problem you've been turning over for 2 days and have finally decided how to approach. The other figure was a man, early 40s, sharp-featured, sitting with a laptop and a legal pad, who gave Landon a brief professional nod and then looked back at his screen. "Mr. Pierce." She gestured toward the chair across from her. "Thank you for coming." He sat. She sat. The man with the laptop didn't introduce himself and apparently wasn't going to. "I'm going to be direct with you," she said. "Okay. 3 nights ago, you entered a room in my home without authorization and observed something private." Her voice was level, not angry, or not only angry, but the kind of controlled that is anger running through a narrow pipe. "I have reviewed the security footage. I spoke with Gerald. I understand it was accidental." "It was." "I know." She held his gaze. "That doesn't change what you saw." He didn't say anything. "I need to understand something, and I'd like an honest answer." She picked up her coffee, held it without drinking. "What do you think you saw?" Landon looked at her. He thought about saying nothing. He thought about playing dumb, which would have been the safer play, the play a person who wasn't about to complicate his life would make. But she was looking at him with the particular directness of someone who already knew the answer and was asking to see if he'd tell the truth. "Medical monitoring equipment," he said. "Cardiac, and surgical scarring that suggested more than one procedure, spaced over time. You've had a cardiac condition that required multiple interventions, probably starting a few years back." He paused. "I'm not a doctor. I've worked in medical transport. I know what I was looking at." Silence. The man with the laptop had stopped typing. Natalie set her coffee cup down with a soft click. Something in her jaw moved, not a flinch exactly, more like the involuntary adjustment of someone who has absorbed a blow they were expecting and is recalibrating anyway. "How many people have you told?" she asked. "No one." "Mr. Pierce, no one," he said again. "I haven't told anyone. It's not my information to tell." She studied him for a long moment. He got the impression this was something she did habitually, held a prolonged silence while assessing, and that most people found it uncomfortable. He didn't find it comfortable exactly, but he was tired and he'd driven 40 minutes, and he wasn't in a position to feel intimidated by a pause. "Why not?" she asked. "Because it would hurt someone I don't know anything about for no reason that benefits anyone." He shifted in the chair. "Also, I was technically trespassing. I'm not going to go tell people what I accidentally saw while I was in the wrong part of someone's house." Another silence. Then she said, "You have a daughter." He went very still. "I'm not threatening you," she said quickly, and there was something in her voice then, not warmth exactly, but the thing that comes right before warmth in a person who hasn't practiced it in a while. "I did a basic background check before this meeting. I know about your situation, the school, the medical appointments." She paused. "I know you need money and that you're managing a lot alone." "Most people are managing a lot alone." "Yes." She looked at the table for a moment. "I have an unusual request, and before I make it, I want to be clear that if you say no, you leave this room and nothing happens to you. You keep your delivery contracts. No one contacts your employer. We never speak again. I mean that." Landon looked at her. "What's the request?" Natalie Ashford leaned forward, very slightly, elbows on the table, and for the first time she looked less like a CEO and more like a person, tired, calculating, in the position of having to ask for something from someone she didn't know and wouldn't normally need anything from. "I'm in the middle of a major acquisition," she said, "a billion-dollar deal with Harmont Consolidated. The signing is 9 weeks out. My board of directors has significant concerns about my health, unfounded concerns or mostly unfounded, and my competitors have people watching everything I do and everyone around me. She stopped, then continued. My regular driver retired 3 months ago. His replacement is new and hasn't been vetted the way I need. My current personal assistant is brilliant, but she's been with me long enough that she's on people's radar. A pause. I need someone no one is looking at, someone completely outside my professional circle, someone who, if they were seen with me, would not register as significant to anyone trying to gather information about my situation. Landon was quiet. A delivery driver, he said. A delivery driver who, by a significant accident of timing, already knows the thing I'm most afraid of anyone finding out. Her voice was flat and direct, which means the leverage, such as it is, runs both ways. You already have something you could use. I'm not asking you not to use it. I'm asking you to work with me for 9 weeks, with compensation, and to continue not using it. How much compensation? She named a number. Landon kept his face still, which was an effort. It was more than 6 months of delivery income, paid out weekly, plus expenses, plus a healthcare stipend that she mentioned at the end with the ease of someone for whom money was arithmetic, not geography, which it clearly was, but the number she'd attached to the stipend was enough to cover Mara's specialist visits through the end of the year. He thought about saying yes immediately. He thought about the instinct he'd developed over 32 years in a city that didn't forgive mistakes, the one that said, when something sounds too good, find the catch. What does the job actually look like, he asked. Day to day. Driving. Most mornings, some evenings, attending certain functions as staff, not prominently, in the background. Running personal errands that I can't send my current staff on without it appearing significant. Occasionally being present at internal meetings in a non-speaking capacity, because having someone I trust who isn't identified as an analyst or advisor means I have a set of eyes that isn't being tracked. She paused. And being discreet, in every circumstance, about everything. What happens if the deal falls apart? Then you're paid through the full 9 weeks regardless. What if you have a medical event? A silence. What? She said. A medical event. An episode. Something related to the condition you're managing. He held her gaze. I've worked medical transport. I've sat with people having emergencies who needed someone nearby who knew what to do. If something happens while I'm driving you, I need to know what it is and what the response should be. Natalie Ashford looked at him for a long moment. The man with the laptop had gone very still. That is, she said finally, not a question anyone has asked me in a professional context before. Do you want me to unask it? No. Something shifted in her face. It wasn't a smile, so it was too small for that, and too complicated. I'll give you a briefing on my condition, the basics, what to watch for, what to do. She paused. If you accept. Landon thought about Mara's appointment on Tuesday, about the copay, and about the thing the cardiologist had said in February, watchful waiting, and about how that phrase meant something different when you were watching a 7-year-old who had her mother's face and your own gray-green eyes and ate crackers in the wrong order and asked very carefully whether things were expensive. He thought about the delivery route and the broken defroster and the knock in the back left tire. He thought about a woman standing in front of a mirror who had spent years covering up something that was eating at her, and the specific quality of the fury on her face when she'd turned and found him there. Fury that had something behind it, something older and more exhausting than anger, something that looked like the long, grinding effort of someone who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time. I need the weekends, he said. For my daughter. And I need flexibility on school pickup days. Manageable. And if at any point this feels like something that's going to come back on me legally, it won't. But if it does, I'll provide documentation of the arrangement that protects your position. She reached across the table and slid a single folded sheet of paper toward him. That's not the contract. That's my personal statement, signed, that this meeting occurred at my invitation and under my assurance of your safety. Take it with you today regardless of your answer. He looked at the paper without picking it up. Then he picked it up. He unfolded it, read it. It was exactly what she'd said it was. 3 sentences, her signature, dated that morning. He folded it back and put it in his jacket pocket. Okay, he said. Okay, you'll do it? Yeah. Natalie Ashford absorbed this with almost no visible reaction, which he would come to understand was how she absorbed most things. Processing internally, showing nothing, filing the information away with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned early that showing your reactions gave other people a map to your vulnerabilities. "I'll have the formal contract sent to you by Monday," she said. "You start Wednesday." "Wednesday. I have a morning meeting at Harmont Consolidated's downtown office. I'll need to be there at 8:30. She stood, and so did he, and she held out her hand across the table with the briskness of someone who had completed a transaction and was already thinking about the next one. He shook it. Her grip was firm, and her hand was cold despite the coffee cup, and she let go after exactly the right number of seconds. Not the practiced grip of someone performing authority, but the grip of someone who didn't think much about the performance of things and just did them. "Mr. Pierce." "Miss Ashford." He rode the elevator down alone, with the folded paper in his jacket pocket and the number she'd named still running quietly through the back of his head. And he walked out into the Saturday morning air and stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside the glass building before he remembered where he'd parked. The sun was out. After 2 days of rain, the city looked briefly rinsed and clean, the kind of clean it only ever managed for a morning before going back to itself. A food cart was opening up on the corner. Someone's kid was running ahead of them on the sidewalk, arms out, no coat. Landon Pierce had gone to make a delivery and walked through the wrong door, and now he was going to drive a billionaire to work on Wednesday. He thought, walking into that building 20 minutes ago, that he understood what was happening. Now he was less sure, not about his decision, which felt correct in the specific way that decisions made under financial pressure sometimes do, where correct means necessary rather than wise, but about the whole shape of the thing he'd just agreed to. There was a woman on the 14th floor who was managing something enormous and doing it largely alone. He'd seen 30 seconds of it, unintentionally, and somehow that had made him the safest person in her orbit. He didn't know what to do with that yet. He walked to his car, got in, and drove home to his daughter. "You said." Part 2. Louis. Viết 4.500 liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện. Pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liên mạch khi ghép lại. Part 2 lưu ý, viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện. Pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ. Phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sang. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau, câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chi dần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more 10:25. Claude responded. The contract arrived Monday morning, sent to his personal email at 7:04 a.m. The contract arrived Monday morning, sent to his personal email at 7:04 a.m. by Claire Voss, who apparently kept hours that started before most people's alarms went off. It was 11 pages. Landon sat at the kitchen table after dropping Mara at school and read all 11 of them, which took 40 minutes and 2 cups of coffee and one moment around page 7, where he stopped and reread a clause 3 times because he wasn't sure he understood what it was protecting him from. He understood it on the 4th read. It was protecting him from her. Specifically, it outlined that in the event of any dispute arising from his employment, the burden of proof for any claim of impropriety would rest with Ashford Capital Group, not with him. His attorney, he didn't have one, but the clause assumed he did, would have full access to all communications logs. It was, his instinct told him, the kind of clause you put in a contract when you're the more powerful party and you're trying to demonstrate, in writing, that you're aware of that imbalance. He signed it and sent it back. Wednesday arrived the way significant days sometimes do, unremarkably, with overcast skies and a traffic backup on the interstate that had him checking his watch twice before he even got close to the address Claire had sent. Not the mansion. A building on the east side with underground parking and a private elevator that required a key card to operate, which Natalie's assistant had dropped off the previous day in a sealed envelope via courier. He was in the underground lot at 8:08. She came out of the elevator at 8:17, wearing a dark coat, carrying a leather portfolio, not looking at her phone the way most people did when they walked. She looked at where she was going. She looked at him. She got in the back seat. "You're early," she said. Traffic was lighter than expected. She buckled her seatbelt. "Take Meridian Avenue to the Harmont building. Don't use the app. The suggested route goes past a construction site that's been adding 20 minutes since October. I know the area." A pause. "Okay." That was the entirety of the conversation for the next 12 minutes. She worked in the back seat. He could hear the quiet rhythm of fingers on a keyboard, the occasional page turn. And he drove. And the city moved past the windows, and neither of them tried to fill the silence with anything. He appreciated that. He hadn't expected to appreciate it, but he did. The Harmont building was a glass tower on the financial district's main corridor, with a drop-off circle that a security guard was already monitoring when they pulled in. Natalie was out of the car before he'd fully stopped. Not reckless, just efficient. The movement of someone who had calculated the exact moment it was safe to exit and executed accordingly. "I'll be 2 hours," she said, not looking back. "There's a parking structure on the next block. I'll be here." She went through the revolving doors, and he pulled out of the circle and found the structure and backed into a spot on the second level where he had a clear view of the building entrance. Then he sat. He'd brought a book, a worn paperback he'd been working through for 3 weeks, one of those crime novels where the detective was more broken than the criminals. And he read for an hour and 20 minutes before she came back out, 4 minutes ahead of schedule, walking slightly faster than she'd gone in. He was at the drop-off circle before she reached it. She got in. He pulled out. She didn't say anything for 2 blocks. "That went differently than I expected," she said finally. It wasn't directed at him exactly, more the kind of statement people make to the air when they're processing. But he was the only other person in the car. "Better or worse?" She seemed briefly surprised that he'd responded. "Better? Possibly." She looked out the window, which sometimes means something's wrong, and I haven't found it yet. He didn't answer that. It seemed like the kind of thought that didn't need a response, just room to sit. They drove. The first week was like that. Mornings mostly, a few evenings, one Saturday pickup, from a private airport where she returned from a trip looking like she hadn't slept and spent the entire drive home reviewing documents on her tablet without speaking. He learned the routes she preferred. He learned that she took her coffee black and that she didn't want it offered, only provided when she asked. He learned that she answered her own phone unless she specifically told him to say she was unavailable, and that when she said she needed 15 minutes, she generally meant 12. He didn't learn much else. She didn't offer it, and he didn't ask. What he did learn, gradually, in the accumulating way that you learn things about people when you spend hours in the same enclosed space, was the texture of her tension. There was a baseline level of controlled alertness that seemed to be her default mode, the professional operating temperature of someone who had spent a decade treating every room like a room that might be against her. And then there were the other moments, smaller and less controlled, that happened when she didn't think anyone was paying attention. The slight shift in her breathing sometimes, on long drives, when she thought he was focused on the road. A pause before she answered certain phone calls. Not hesitation exactly, more the brief recalibration of someone switching modes. Once, stuck in traffic on a Tuesday afternoon, he'd glanced in the rearview mirror and found her with one hand pressed flat against her sternum and her eyes closed, not panicking, not performing, just pressing, like she was checking for something. She opened her eyes and found him looking. He looked back at the road. Neither of them said anything, but the next morning she got in the car, and before she opened her portfolio, she said, without preamble, "The condition is called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. The wall of the left ventricle is thickened. It restricts outflow during exertion and sometimes at rest." Her voice was clinical, flat, the voice of someone reciting from a file. I've had 2 procedures, one ablation, one surgical myectomy. I'm on medication that manages it most of the time. The patch monitors heart rate and rhythm and sends data to my cardiologist. Landon kept his eyes on the road. What does a bad episode look like? Dizziness, sometimes chest pressure, once fainting. A pause. That was 2 years ago. I haven't fainted since. What should I do if it happens? Don't call an ambulance. He glanced in the rear view. That's the wrong answer. It would be in the press within an hour. A cardiac event being in the press is better than call this number. She leaned forward and set a card on the console. Dr. Renata Foss. She's my cardiologist. She has a private emergency line. She can deploy a medical team discreetly. A beat. She's who you call first. If she doesn't answer within 90 seconds, then you call 911. That's the protocol. He picked up the card and looked at it and put it in his jacket's inner pocket, next to the folded statement she'd given him on Saturday. Okay, she said, and picked up her portfolio. That was the most personal conversation they'd had in 10 days. He told Mara he'd started a new job. She asked what kind of job, and he said driving, which was true. And she said, was it like the old job? And he said, not exactly. And she said, did it pay more? And he said, yes. And she thought about this for a moment with the particular gravity that 7-year-olds bring to financial information they can't fully contextualize. And then she said, can we get the crackers that have 2 kinds of cheese? Yeah. Both flavors. Sure. She seemed satisfied with this and went back to her homework, which was about fractions and which she did not find as easy as cheese crackers, but was working through with the same focused patience she brought to most things. He sat at the table across from her and watched her work and thought about thickened ventricle walls and surgical myectomies and the specific way she'd pressed her hand to her chest in traffic, not alarmed, just checking, the way someone checks for something they've learned to expect. Mara looked up. You're staring. Sorry. Are you tired? Little bit. Mrs. Okafor says you should take vitamins. Mrs. Okafor's right. Mara nodded, completely serious. I told her you wouldn't. He laughed. A real one, brief, surprised out of him. And she smiled at her worksheet and went back to her fractions. And he made dinner, and the evening moved through its ordinary rhythms, and it felt fine. It felt, actually, more than fine. It felt like something he'd been missing without knowing he'd been missing it. The specific steadiness of having slightly more than not enough. Of being able to look at Thursday's appointment without the particular dread that was really just math running in the background of everything. The specialist on Tuesday had said watchful waiting again, but this time with a slightly different emphasis. The emphasis of someone who was watching and not particularly concerned by what they were seeing. The irregularity was, in his precise technical language, stable with a favorable trajectory. Landon had asked what that meant in plain terms, and the doctor had said, it means we think she's going to be fine. We want to keep seeing her every 3 months for another year, but the indicators are good. Mara had been in the examination room, listening to all of this with the focused attention of a child who understood that the adults were talking about her heart and that this mattered. And when the doctor finished, she'd looked at Landon and said, does that mean I can do gymnastics? The doctor had smiled. Let's revisit that in 3 months. Mara had accepted this with the grace of someone keeping their options open. Landon had sat in the parking lot afterward for 5 minutes before he could make himself drive. By the 3rd week, he'd started to understand the shape of what was actually happening inside Ashford Capital Group. Not because anyone explained it to him, but because he was present, peripheral, and people in high-pressure professional environments have a tendency to forget that the person who is not identified as significant is still in the room. The Harmont acquisition was not going smoothly. He knew this from fragments. A call she took on speakerphone once when she forgot to plug in her earpiece, in which a man named Warren said the word liability 4 times in 2 minutes. A comment she made to Claire in the lobby of a building they were leaving where she said quietly and without drama, get me the revised projections before 6 because Fletcher is going to use the old ones to make the case Thursday, and I need to be ahead of it. He knew it from the particular quality of her silence on certain drives, which was different from the regular working silence, tighter, the silence of someone doing calculations under pressure. Fletcher, he would learn, was Marcus Fletcher. Board member. Longtime Ashford Capital investor who had, according to what he could piece together, begun raising questions about Natalie's long-term capacity for leadership approximately 8 months ago, a phrase that meant something specific in the context of a CEO who had been quietly managing a heart condition and had never disclosed it to the board. He was not supposed to know this. He was the driver. He sat in the front seat and kept his eyes on the road, but he noticed things. That was increasingly what she was paying him to do, among other things. And he was discovering that noticing things was something he'd been doing his whole life without calling it that. He'd done it in the home health work, learning a patient's rhythms, knowing when the pain was bad, even when they insisted it wasn't. He'd done it in dispatch, learning which drivers were going to be late before they called in, knowing which routes were going to create problems on certain days. He did it with Mara, knowing when she was tired versus when she was worried, knowing when the thing she said was not the thing she meant. He did it with Natalie Ashford, and what he noticed in the third week was that she was pushing harder than she should be. It wasn't obvious. She was too controlled for it to be obvious. But he'd driven her to 3 early morning meetings in 5 days, and 2 of them had been before 7 a.m. And she'd been in the car each time looking like she'd already been awake for 2 hours, and once when she'd taken off her coat in the back seat, he'd seen the monitoring patch through the thin fabric of her blouse, and caught, in the mirror, the faint light on it pulsing at a cadence that was slightly faster than resting. He didn't say anything. He drove. But on Thursday, the 5th day in a row she'd been in the car before 7:30, when he pulled up in front of the East Side building and she got in, he said, "Have you eaten?" She looked up from her portfolio. "What? Have you eaten this morning?" "I had coffee." "That's not eating." She blinked at him. It was the expression of someone who had not recently been asked this question and wasn't sure how to process it coming from the direction it was coming from. "I'm fine." "I know. Have you eaten?" A pause. Then, "There's a bakery on the way." "I know where it is." He stopped at the bakery on Clement Street, the one she apparently knew, which meant it was probably a regular stop before he started, though she hadn't mentioned it. And the woman behind the counter had a brown bag ready before he'd fully named what he needed, which told him something about how often Natalie had apparently been sending people in here on her behalf. He brought it back to the car and set it on the console without comment. She took it without comment. She ate something out of it. He could tell from the quiet sounds of a paper bag being opened. He didn't look. When they reached the Harmont building, she got out with the bag still in her hand, and he was watching the traffic flow in the drop-off zone and didn't turn to look, and she paused at the door, just a fraction of a second, not long, and then she went inside. That afternoon, when he picked her up, there was a second coffee cup in the center console when he arrived. His usual order. He'd gotten coffee from the cart near the parking structure twice in the past 2 weeks, and apparently she or someone she'd sent had noticed. A medium dark roast with 1 sugar, still warm. He looked at it. He got in the car, picked it up, and drove to the entrance. She got in. He pulled out. Neither of them said anything about it. They drove back through the city in the particular late afternoon light that turned everything amber and slightly unreal. And she worked and he drove, and the traffic on the bridge was bad but predictable. And he found a gap in the merge lane earlier than the GPS would have, and she looked up briefly from her screen as he took the alternate and then looked back down. "Good call," she said. "Bridge backs up at 5:20 on Thursdays." "I know, my last driver always forgot." He drank his coffee. "I won't eat." The problem with Marcus Fletcher became concrete on a Thursday, near the end of the 3rd week. Landon was in the lobby of the Ashford Capitol building, not the main floor, the private lobby on the executive level that required a badge he'd been issued in week 2, waiting near the elevator while Natalie was in a meeting that had been scheduled for 45 minutes and was now running close to 90. He was reading his book. He was not paying attention to the 2 men who came out of the conference room to the left and stopped near the window to continue a conversation they'd apparently started inside. He was not paying attention, but they were not being quiet. "Board meeting is in 2 weeks, one of them said. He was heavy-set, late 50s, the kind of expensive suit that was meant to communicate authority rather than taste. If the Harmont terms come back the way I think they're coming back, Fletcher's going to move for the vote. He can't move without majority, the other said. Younger, careful. He's been working the majority for 6 months. Huang is with him, possibly Sorensen. A pause. If Natalie doesn't close Harmont clean, he's got the numbers. And if she does close it clean, a longer pause, then it's delayed, not defeated. He's been building this case for a year. The health concerns, no one's confirmed anything about her health. They don't need to confirm. They need to create enough uncertainty that the other investors get nervous, and Fletcher can frame it as risk mitigation. The heavy-set man lowered his voice slightly. She's smart, but she's been managing too many things at once, and something's going to slip. They moved away down the hall. Landon looked back at his book without seeing it. He was still thinking about what he'd heard when the elevator opened and Natalie came out. She looked at him once, quick, assessing, and whatever she read on his face made her slow down slightly. "What?" she said. "Nothing. Ready when you are." She studied him for one more second. Then she walked toward the elevator without pushing it, turned and said, "What did you hear?" It wasn't a question. He told her, briefly, accurately, without editorializing. The two men, what they'd said, the specifics about Fletcher and the board vote, and the phrase risk mitigation. She listened with her arms at her sides and her face doing nothing in particular, which by now he understood meant she was running through implications at speed. "Describe the heavy-set one," she said. He described him. "Raymond Chu," she said, mostly to herself. "He's supposed to be neutral." Something shifted in her expression. "He's not neutral." "I shouldn't have told you. If you're going to have to pretend you don't know—" "No!" Her voice was sharp. "No, I needed to know that. Thank you." She said it the way she said most things, directly, without excess, but the thank you had actual weight to it. Not performative, just real. He nodded. The elevator came. They rode down together in silence, and when they reached the underground parking level, she said, "I need to make 2 calls before we leave. Give me 10 minutes. Take what you need." She walked to the far end of the lot, phone already at her ear, and he leaned against the car and waited. He could hear the tone of the calls, but not the words. The first one was short and measured. The second one was longer, and once she turned and looked back at him across the dim concrete space, not with suspicion, but with something he couldn't fully read, and then looked away again. When she came back, she got in the car without saying what the calls had been about, and he didn't ask, and they drove out into the evening. But somewhere on the bridge, with the bay going gray and silver below them in the last of the light, she said, 2 weeks ago, I would have found out about Chu at the board meeting. That would have been too late to do anything about it before the vote. She was looking out the window. Finding out now means I have time. Okay. That's what I'm paying you for, she said. Not unkindly, just precisely. I know. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm also paying you for the driving. The driving's easier. He heard something that might have been a quiet exhale that was also the smallest possible version of a laugh. She covered it immediately by clearing her throat and opening her portfolio, and he kept his eyes on the road and said nothing, and they drove the rest of the way in the ordinary working silence that had become, without either of them exactly planning it, one of the more functional things in both their days. The city rolled past. The lights came on. Somewhere on the north side of the bridge, Landon Pierce thought about a woman pressing her hand to her chest in traffic, and a man in a conference room building a case out of other people's fears, and the 9 weeks that had started with a wrong door and an accidental look that had led, somehow, to here, to this car, this bridge, this unlikely and still fragile arrangement that neither of them had asked for, and both of them, for entirely different reasons, needed to hold together. He took the exit. He drove her home. You said, Part B. Lưu ý. Viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Part 3. Lưu ý. Viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước
không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch,
sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau, câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chi dần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more 1028, Claude responded. The shareholders event was on a Friday evening, 6 days after the conversation on the bridge about Raymond Chu, and Natalie spent the entire week moving like... The shareholders event was on a Friday evening, 6 days after the conversation on the bridge about Raymond Chu, and Natalie spent the entire week moving like someone who had identified the location of every landmine in a field and was now walking through it with controlled, deliberate steps. Landon drove her to 4 separate meetings in 5 days. He picked up documents she didn't want couriered. He waited in lobbies and parking structures, and once in the basement kitchen of a private members club where a chef was prepping for a dinner service and didn't ask him anything, just handed him a coffee and went back to his work. He overheard things he wasn't meant to overhear and reported the ones that seemed relevant and kept the rest to himself. And by Thursday night, he had a reasonably clear picture of what Friday was actually about. The event was framed as a quarterly shareholder reception. Cocktails, presentations, the kind of evening where money talked to money in a room that had good lighting and better wine. But the real function of it, as far as Landon could piece together, was a test. Fletcher and his people would be watching Natalie. The undecided board members would be watching her. The institutional investors who had the most to gain or lose from the Harmont deal would be watching her. And what they were all watching for, underneath the conversation about quarterly returns and strategic positioning, was the same thing. Any sign of weakness, any stumble, literal or figurative, any indication that the woman running this company might not be capable of running it through a billion-dollar acquisition and whatever came after. He understood this. He also understood, from 5 weeks of driving her and watching her manage the gap between what she was and what she needed to appear to be, that Friday was going to cost her something. She confirmed this, in her way, on Thursday evening when he dropped her off. She was gathering her things from the back seat, and she stopped and said, "Tomorrow night, I need you inside the venue." He turned in his seat. Inside. There's a staff designation, event support. You'd be in the main room, not visible, but present. She said it with her eyes on her portfolio, the way she sometimes said things she was slightly uncomfortable saying. I need someone in the room who knows what to watch for. What are you expecting? I'm not expecting anything specific. A pause. I want someone there who knows the difference between me having a bad moment and me having a medical event. He looked at her. Okay? You'd need to look like you belong there. I'll have something sent over tomorrow morning. What time does it start? 7. I need to be there at 6:30 for the pre-event. She finally looked at him. You can bring someone if you need coverage for your daughter. I'll sort it. She nodded and got out. He watched her go through the lobby door and then sat in the parking circle for a moment, engine idling, thinking about what she'd actually just asked him. Not to drive, to be present in a room full of people who were looking for cracks, and to be the only person there whose job was specifically to watch her. He called Mrs. Okafor, who said, of course, bring Mara over after school. She'd make the jollof rice that Mara had been asking about for 2 weeks. He thanked her and hung up and drove home. The something sent over Friday morning was a dark suit and a garment bag, his approximate size, close enough that it looked intentional rather than borrowed, and a note from Claire that said, Event support lanyards at staff entrance, south side. Ask for Kevin. Nothing else. He put the suit on at 5:30 and looked at himself in the bathroom mirror, which was small enough that he could only see himself from the chest up, and thought that he looked like someone who belonged in a different life. Then he thought that was a stupid thing to think, buttoned the jacket, and went to check on Mara before dropping her at Mrs. Okafor's. Mara looked at him for a long moment. "You look different," she said. "New suit." "For the job?" "Yeah." She thought about this. "Is it a nice job?" "Getting there." She seemed to accept this. She was in her pajamas with her overnight bag already packed. She'd packed it herself, which she'd started doing recently. This small evidence of competence that caught him off guard sometimes. And she hugged him at the door of Mrs. Okafor's apartment with the particular grip of a child who was fine but wanted him to know she'd noticed he was leaving. "I'll be back before you wake up," he said. "You always say that." "I always mean it." She let go. Mrs. Okafor appeared in the doorway with the smell of rice and tomato paste coming from somewhere behind her, and Mara turned toward it with the focused interest of someone who had already moved on, and Landon went back down the stairs. The venue was a renovated waterfront building, old industrial bones, new glass, and steel insertions, the kind of space that suggested both history and forward momentum, which was probably intentional. Landon found Kevin at the staff entrance at 6:10. Kevin was 20-something, efficient, indifferent to who Landon was, which was ideal. He handed over a lanyard and a brief rundown of the evening's flow and pointed him toward the main room. The main room was large. High ceilings, long windows overlooking the bay, a stage at the far end with a podium and a screen for the presentation portion of the evening. Circular tables, each set for 8, a bar running the length of the left wall. Staff moving through with the synchronized competence of people who had done this dozens of times. Landon took a position near the right wall, between a service station and a structural pillar, where he had sight lines to the stage, the main entrance, and approximately 70% of the room. He could see the bar. He could see the tables nearest the stage. He could not see the private anteroom to the left of the stage entrance, but he could see everyone who came out of it. Natalie came out of it at 6:42. She was in a dark green dress, structured, not elaborate, and she had her hair up, and she was talking to a man Landon didn't recognize while simultaneously scanning the room, which was filling quickly now. He watched her find him. A single look, a fraction of a second, and then she was back to the man beside her. He stayed where he was. The next 90 minutes were the particular slow tension of a room where everyone was performing. He watched it the way he'd learned to watch things. Not at the center of action, but at the edges, where the unperformed reactions happened. He watched a woman with silver hair navigate the room with the systematic efficiency of someone working a list. He watched 2 men near the bar who'd arrived together separate and moved toward opposite ends of the room, which struck him as deliberate. He watched a heavy-set man in a dark suit arrive at 7:15 and move immediately toward a cluster of guests near the window, shaking hands, leaning in to speak quietly, and he recognized Marcus Fletcher from the description Natalie had given him 2 weeks ago. Fletcher was good at it. Landon would give him that. He didn't look like a man mounting a campaign. He looked like a man enjoying a cocktail party and happening to talk to people he knew. But the route he took through the room was not random. He was visiting specific people in a specific order, and the conversations were brief, but the body language after each one was the body language of someone checking items off a list. Landon tracked him. He didn't move from his position, but he watched where Fletcher went and who he spoke to, and when Fletcher finally reached Raymond Chu near the third table, and the 2 men held a conversation that lasted almost 4 minutes, Landon noted the time on his watch. Natalie was at the front of the room, talking to a group of investors. From where Landon stood, she looked fine, composed, attentive, laughing at the right moments, asking questions that made the people she was talking to stand a little straighter. She was good at this. He'd known that intellectually, but watching it in real time was different. There was a skill to it that looked effortless and was anything but, and he knew it was anything but because he'd spent 5 weeks watching the cost of it. The formal presentation started at 8. The lights dimmed. The room settled. Natalie took the stage. She spoke for 22 minutes. He'd seen the presentation materials in fragments. She'd reviewed sections of it in the car twice, but hearing it assembled was different. She was precise and confident, and she had the specific quality of someone who understood not just the content but the audience, who knew which numbers to emphasize and which to let breathe and where to pause and let a slide do the work. The room was attentive. He watched Fletcher during the presentation. Fletcher watched the room more than the stage, which told him something. When she finished, the applause was real. Not performed. Real. The kind that happens when a room that came in skeptical leaves impressed. She stepped off the stage and was immediately surrounded by people wanting to continue the conversation, and Landon watched from his position and thought, she's fine. She's more than fine. She's winning this room. He let himself relax slightly, the first time since he'd arrived. That was when he saw it. She was mid-conversation with a man who was clearly one of the larger institutional investors. Older, careful, the kind of person who asked questions that sounded like compliments. And she paused. Not a natural pause. A pause that was slightly too long, that had a quality to it that he'd learned to recognize in the back seat of the car on long drives. Her head tilted a fraction. Her hand, the one not holding her glass, moved almost imperceptibly toward her side. The investor didn't notice. He was talking. Landon was already moving. He crossed the room at the pace of someone who belonged there and had a reason to be walking in that direction. Not rushing, not running, just moving with purpose, the way event staff moved. And he reached her while the investor was still talking, and he said, quietly, leaning slightly in as though delivering a message, "Ms. Ashford, your call from Singapore. They said it's the time-sensitive one." She looked at him. In her eyes, for one brief second, was something unguarded. Relief, maybe, or the close cousin of it. "Excuse me," she said to the investor, smooth and immediate. "I have to take this. Can we continue after the cocktail hour?" The investor smiled. "Of course." Landon walked ahead of her, not beside her, toward the anteroom to the left of the stage. He held the door. She went through. He followed and let it close behind them. The anteroom was small. A table, 4 chairs, a side counter with a water service. She set her glass down on the counter and pressed both palms flat against the surface and stood that way for a moment, head down, breathing carefully. He didn't say anything. He poured water from the pitcher on the counter and set the glass near her right hand. She picked it up after a moment and drank half of it. "How long has it been building?" he asked. "Since the presentation." Her voice was steady but thin. "I was fine during. After, when I stopped moving, it hit. The dizziness? Pressure. And the rate's up, I can feel it." She set the glass down. "I just need a few minutes." "Okay." He pulled out his phone and opened the contacts. Dr. Renata Foss was in there. He'd added her the same day Natalie had given him the card, 3 weeks ago. His thumb rested over the number. "Tell me if you need me to call." "I'll tell you." She stood upright slowly. "Don't hover." He stepped back 2 paces and sat in one of the chairs and looked at the wall. She breathed. He could hear it. Slow, deliberate. The breathing of someone who'd practiced managing this. Not panicking. Managing. There was a difference, and he recognized it from his time in medical transport. The difference between a patient who'd never faced their condition and one who'd lived with it long enough to know the edges of it. After 4 minutes, she said, "I need to go back out there." "You don't have to. Fletcher will notice if I disappear. He's been watching me all night." She pushed off the counter and straightened. "How do I look?" He looked at her. "Like someone who just gave a presentation that went well and stepped out to take a call." Something crossed her face. "That's a diplomatic answer." "It's also accurate." She reached up and checked that her hair was still in order, the small automatic self-assessment of someone who'd been monitored for so long it had become reflex. Then she looked at him directly. "The investor I was talking to, Callum Park, he manages one of the 3 largest positions in the company. If he walks out of here tonight uncertain about me, Fletcher doesn't need the board vote to create a problem." "He didn't look uncertain when you walked away." "No?" He looked like he was already looking forward to finishing the conversation. She took a breath. "Okay." Another breath. "Okay, I'm going back out." "I'll be at the right wall," he said. "Same position." She nodded and reached for the door, and then stopped with her hand on the handle and turned back. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not grateful exactly, not warm exactly, but something that was a direct and undecorated version of both. Something that acknowledged, without saying it, that she had needed someone and he had been there and that this was not nothing. "The Singapore call?" she said. "That was quick thinking. You had your hand on your ribs. I needed a reason to move." She looked at him for one more second. Then she opened the door and went back into the room, and he gave her 30 seconds and followed, returning to his position by the right wall, and he watched her cross the room back toward Callum Park as though she'd never left, as though the last 6 minutes hadn't happened, as though she were simply a woman who'd stepped out to handle one thing and had returned to handle another. She was good at it. He already knew that. But watching her do it tonight, after what he'd just seen in that small room, the palms on the counter, the careful breathing, the 4 minutes of pure maintenance before she walked back into the performance, it settled into something different than admiration, something that was closer to understanding. Fletcher approached her at 9:15. Landon watched it happen from across the room. Fletcher moving toward her with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed the evening had gone his way, extending a hand, leaning in to say something that made her smile in the specific way she smiled at people she did not trust. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. Landon couldn't hear any of it, but he read what he could read. Her posture, which was open and unhurried, his, which was doing the careful work of someone probing for weakness while pretending to make conversation. When they parted, Fletcher moved toward the bar with the look of a man who hadn't gotten what he'd come for. Landon exhaled. At 9:40, the event began winding down. Guests made their rounds of goodbyes. The bar traffic thinned. Natalie moved through the final 30 minutes of the evening with the systematic grace of someone completing a task. And when the last significant guest had left, and the event staff were beginning the quiet work of breakdown, she found Landon near the exit and said, "Get the car." He got the car. She came out at 10:12, coat on, portfolio under her arm, moving slightly more slowly than usual. He had the door open. She got in and sat back and closed her eyes, and he got in the front and pulled out of the lot and drove. He didn't say anything for 10 minutes. Then, "How are you feeling?" A pause. "Tired." "The pressure?" "Better." It evened out around 9. She opened her eyes. "I need you to know that what happened tonight, the anteroom, that cannot leave that room." "I know." "Not to anyone. Not your neighbor, not your friend, not—" "I know," he said again. Not impatiently, just clearly. "I understand what you're trusting me with. I've understood it since the beginning." Silence. "I know you have," she said. It cost her something to say it. He could hear that. Not the saying itself, but the acknowledging of it. The acknowledgement that she'd been watching him and had concluded that he was trustworthy, which meant she'd been operating for weeks in the particular anxiety of not yet being certain. He drove. At a red light on the bridge approach, she said, "Fletcher didn't get what he wanted tonight." "I know, I watched him. Callum Park told me, just before I came out, that he's considering increasing his position." She was looking at the city lights on the water. "That's a reversal from 2 weeks ago. He was cooling on us. Tonight helped. Tonight helped." She said it with the flatness of someone who understood exactly how much it had cost and was trying not to calculate it. "We're 5 weeks out from the Harmont signing. If I can keep the board stable and close the deal clean, Fletcher loses his window. And if you can't, then I've built this company for 9 years and I'll spend another 9 years dealing with the consequences of 1 quarter where everything went wrong at once." She said it evenly, without self-pity. It was worse for the evenness. "But I'm going to close it." Landon looked at the road ahead. The bridge, the bay, the lights of the city resolving out of the dark on the other side. "What do you actually need to get through the next 5 weeks? Honestly." She was quiet for a moment. "2 things. The Harmont terms need to hold, and I need my board to see me as someone who is not, in any way, declining." She paused. "The second one is harder, because it's not entirely in your control." "No." A beat. "It's not." He thought about that for a while. About a woman who'd spent 9 years building something that was now being threatened not by any failure of her own making, but by the visible fact of being human, of having a body that did things she couldn't entirely prevent and couldn't publicly explain. of needing to hold a room for 6 hours on a night when her heart rate was elevated and she could feel it, and doing it, and then walking out of an anteroom after 4 minutes and going back to work. He thought about Mara's cardiologist saying watchful waiting and what it meant to watch something you couldn't control with any tool except time. The Harmont people, he said, their lead negotiator, the one who was in the car with you last week. He seemed more comfortable with you than with the associate she brought. Denise Harmon. Natalie's voice shifted slightly, a register of assessment he'd learned to recognize. She's the one I need. She talked to you differently, like she already trusted you and was waiting for her board to catch up. Silence. Then, I noticed that too. If you can get a session with just her before the formal signing window, you might be able to lock the terms before Fletcher has a chance to introduce uncertainty through your board. Another silence, longer. She stopped. That's not a bad idea? You probably already thought of it. I thought of a version of it. Yours is more direct. She looked at the back of his head. You're not just a driver. He kept his eyes on the road. Tonight I was. Tonight you were exactly what I needed, she said, and the way she said it had none of the professional precision of a person managing a transaction. It had the simpler quality of someone telling a plain truth without decoration, because decoration would have made it less. He pulled off the bridge and navigated through the residential streets toward the East Side building. She sat in the back seat, not working for the first time since he'd started driving her. No portfolio, no phone, just sitting in the quiet of a car at the end of a long and grinding night. He thought she might be asleep. He didn't check. When he pulled up to the lobby entrance, she was awake. She gathered herself, coat, portfolio, the particular reassembly of a person who has allowed themselves to be still for 20 minutes. And when she opened the door, she paused on the threshold. Mara, she said, you said she has an appointment next week. He'd mentioned it once, in passing, in the context of rescheduling a morning pickup. He'd said maybe 3 sentences about it. He hadn't expected her to retain any of it. Tuesday, he said. Is she... She stopped. Tried again. Is she okay? They think so. He paused. Getting better indicators. Natalie Ashford stood at the door of his car in the lamplight with her portfolio under her arm, and she nodded once, and it was not a professional nod. It was the nod of a person who had heard something they genuinely wanted to hear. Then she went inside. He watched the lobby door close behind her, and he sat in the car for a moment, engine running, street quiet around him. He thought about the anteroom, about the palms on the counter and the careful breathing and the 4 minutes that nobody else in that room of 200 people had known about Fletcher and his systematic path through a cocktail party and the particular cruelty of building a case against someone using their humanity against them. He thought about Natalie saying, I'm going to close it with that specific evenness that wasn't bravery, or wasn't only bravery, but was the voice of someone who had decided a long time ago that the alternative was not available to her. He put the car in drive. He went to collect his daughter from Mrs. Okafor's, who handed her over asleep, already bundled in her coat, her overnight bag on her shoulder, her face slack and completely unguarded the way children's faces are when they sleep, all the daytime watchfulness gone. He carried her up the 3 flights and got her into bed without waking her and sat on the edge of the mattress for a moment in the dark. She breathed. He listened to it. Outside, the city kept doing what it did, noise and light and the continuous low machinery of people managing whatever they were managing, separately and together, in the particular American dark of a Friday night going into Saturday. He turned off the lamp and went to bed. You said, Part 4, Louis. Viết 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Part 4, Louis. Viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, pha hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên,
Tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sảng. Có yếu tố con người, cấm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau, câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa.
Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chỉ dẫn bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more, 10 giờ 31 phút, Claude responded. The meeting with Denise Harmon happened on a Tuesday, 8 days after the shareholders' event. The meeting with Denise Harmon happened on a Tuesday, 8 days after the shareholders' event. Natalie had arranged it quietly. No Claire involvement, no calendar entry in the shared executive system, nothing that would show up in the logs that Fletcher's people had apparently been monitoring with more consistency than she'd previously assumed. She'd made the call herself, from her personal phone, on a Sunday afternoon while Landon was parked outside a grocery store waiting for her to finish an errand she'd insisted on running alone. He'd been reading his book when she came back out and got in the back seat and said, "Wednesday morning, private breakfast, Denise Harmon and me. I need you to know the location, but I need it out of any system." He'd written the address on the back of a gas station receipt and put it in his jacket pocket. Wednesday came. He drove her to a restaurant in the East Quarter that opened early for private bookings, the kind of place that existed specifically for conversations that needed to happen without an audience. He parked across the street and watched her go in at 8, and he sat with his book and his coffee and waited. She came out at 10:20. He had the car at the curb before she reached the sidewalk. She got in and sat for a moment without speaking, which by now he knew to read not as distress, but as processing. The particular silence of someone sorting through what had just happened before they were ready to characterize it. "Well?" he said, after a sufficient pause. She agreed to the amended terms. Natalie set her portfolio on the seat beside her. Not all of them, 3 of the 5, but the 3 that matter. He pulled into traffic. Is that enough? It changes the signing position significantly. It means when we go to the table in 4 weeks, we're not starting from the draft the board reviewed last month. She looked out the window. Which means Fletcher's version of events, the one where the terms are soft because I've been distracted, is already out of date. He won't know that until the signing. No. Something in her voice that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was in the same neighborhood. He won't. Landon drove. The city in the morning was doing its ordinary Tuesday things. Delivery trucks doubled parked, school buses running late, a group of construction workers eating breakfast on the steps of a building they'd been hired to renovate. He'd been in this city for 32 years, and it still showed him new versions of itself, if he was paying attention, which he usually was. "You should know," Natalie said, "that Denise asked about you." He glanced in the rear view. "About me? She noticed you outside the Harmont building a few weeks ago. She has a good memory for faces." A pause. "I told her you were my driver and that I trusted you completely. She asked how long I'd known you." Another pause. "I told her long enough." He wasn't sure what to do with that. What did she say? She said it must be a short list. A beat. She's not wrong. He drove. The 4 weeks before the signing compressed in the way that high-pressure time always did. Each individual day feeling long and specific, the weeks themselves collapsing into a blur of early mornings, late pickups, lobby waits, and the accumulating texture of being present at the edge of something large. Landon drove. He watched. He reported what seemed relevant. He stayed out of the way of what didn't need him and moved into the frame when it did. He learned the geography of Natalie's professional world in the way you learn a city by driving it, not through any single landmark, but through the accumulated knowledge of how one thing connected to another, where the traffic backed up, which routes looked right on a map but weren't. He learned which of her board members called her directly versus through Claire, and what the difference meant. He learned that the assistant she trusted most after Claire was a 26-year-old named Priya, who had the specific competence of someone who understood everything about the job and said very little about what she understood. He learned that Natalie ate better when things were going well and stopped eating when they weren't, and that this was a reliable indicator of the state of the deal. He also learned, slowly, in the way you learn things about people you spend close time with, things that had nothing to do with the acquisition, that she'd grown up in a house where money was unreliable and loud about being unreliable, and that this was partly why she'd spent her 20s building something that couldn't be taken from her without her knowledge. That she'd been engaged once, briefly, to a man she mentioned exactly once, and then never again, in the context of a conversation about what it cost to prioritize work over everything else. That she had a sister in Portland she called on Sunday evenings from the car, conversations that were the most unguarded he'd ever heard from her. Shorter sentences, less precision, the occasional genuine laugh that was different from her professional laugh, in the same way a real door is different from a door in a painting. He didn't ask about any of these things. He kept them in the part of his mind where he kept things that weren't his to do anything with. What he did ask about, one Thursday afternoon on the bridge when the traffic was slow and she'd closed her portfolio and was just sitting, was the condition. The treatment you've been putting off, he said, is the postponement, is that a choice or is it a timing thing? A long pause. He thought she might not answer. Both, she said. The procedure is elective in the sense that it's not emergency, but it's not optional in the long run. She looked at the water. I've been told the window is in the next 6 to 18 months. After that, the benefit ratio starts shifting. What does it involve? A second surgical myectomy, more targeted than the first. She said it with the flatness of someone who had read the medical literature on it enough times that the clinical language had lost its weight. Recovery is 6 to 8 weeks of reduced activity. She paused. I can't do 6 to 8 weeks of reduced activity in the middle of this. And after the signing? She didn't answer for a moment. After the signing, there's the integration period, then the next quarter review. Then she stopped. There's always a next thing, he said. Yes, that's the problem. She turned and looked at the back of his head. He could feel it. You sound like my cardiologist. Your cardiologist's probably right. She is. A pause. She told me last month that if I keep postponing, the decision is going to get made for me one way or another. She said it without drama, the way she said most things she'd already processed and accepted. She didn't mean it as a threat. She was being accurate. He drove. The traffic loosened past the bridge's midpoint, and he moved into the faster lane without really thinking about it. After the signing, he said, would that be enough clear space? If everything goes the way I need it to go. What would you need to not worry about the company while you recovered? She was quiet for a long time. A succession structure that the board would accept. Priya is ready for more than she's been given. Claire could manage external communications. The Harmont integration team is competent without me in the room. She was ticking through it in her head, he could tell, thinking about it seriously for maybe the first time out loud. I'd need someone in my corner on the board who could run interference with Fletcher. Callum Park. A pause. Possibly. He increased his position after the shareholders' event. He's committed now. If you approach him before the signing, frame it as succession planning for the integration period, not disability planning. No, organizational maturity, building depth in the leadership structure. He changed lanes. That's a thing any good CEO does proactively. It doesn't signal anything except that you're thinking long-term. Another long pause. You've been thinking about this, she said. I drive. There's time to think. She almost laughed. He could tell from the quality of the silence that followed. The particular kind of not laughing that is the cousin of laughing. You're not... She stopped and started again. When I hired you, I thought I was buying discretion and a clean background check. You got those too. I got considerably more than those. She said it without irony. It was just a fact she was acknowledging. He didn't say anything. He took the exit and drove her home, and she got out without the usual brisk efficiency. Slower, more settled, like a person who had put something down that they'd been carrying for too long and was noticing the absence of the weight. The board meeting was on a Thursday, 3 weeks before the signing, and Landon was not in the room for it. He was in the parking structure 2 blocks away, reading, available. He'd driven her there at 7:50 a.m., and she'd gotten out in her charcoal suit with her portfolio and her expression that gave nothing away. And he'd said, "Call me when you're out." And she'd said, "It'll be at least 3 hours." And he'd said, "I'll be here." She called at 11:42. He had the car at the front of the building by the time she came through the lobby doors. She got in. She said nothing. He pulled out and drove. 1 block, 2 blocks. The silence had a weight to it that was different from the working silence, different from the tired silence, different from the processing silence. This was the silence of someone in the aftermath of something significant. "How bad?" he said. Fletcher moved for a vote of no confidence. Her voice was level. He had Chu and one other. Not enough. You had the majority. 6-3. She looked at her hands. But he made the argument, on the record. He said, she stopped. He said there were credible concerns about the CEO's ability to see the Harmont acquisition through to successful integration, given unspecified but documented health-related performance inconsistencies over the past 12 months. Landon was quiet. He didn't name anything specifically. He couldn't, but he put it in the room. Her jaw was tight. Every person in that meeting now has that sentence in their head when they think about the deal. But it didn't carry. This time. She turned to look out the window. If the Harmont terms come back modified, if anything in the next 3 weeks looks like softness from my side, he calls for a second vote, and he'll have spent the intervening time working on the people who voted with me today. Landon drove. He thought about what she'd said on the bridge. There's always a next thing. He thought about Fletcher's systematic route through the cocktail party. He thought about the kind of person who built a campaign against someone using their health as the weapon, framing human limitation as professional failure, making the case that the fact of being a person with a body was a boardroom liability. "What did you say?" he asked, when he made the argument. I let him finish. I didn't interrupt. Then I walked the room through the Harmont term sheet amendments, the ones from the Denise Harmon meeting, and I laid out exactly what we'd secured in terms that Fletcher didn't have and couldn't have anticipated. She paused. I let the numbers make the argument. And 3 of the people he thought were movable voted with me. A long pause. Callum Park spoke after I did. He said the company's acquisition strategy was, in his view, the clearest demonstration of executive capability he'd seen in 15 years of board service. Landon exhaled. Okay. It was a good moment. She said it carefully, as though she wasn't quite ready to trust it. It was a good moment that exists inside a situation that is still not resolved. He drove her to the East Side building, and she got out and paused with her hand on the door frame and said, "I need to tell you something." Her voice had changed. Something underneath the professional register was coming up through it. "Okay," he said. Fletcher's argument, the health-related performance inconsistencies. She was looking at the lobby door, not at him. He submitted documentation. I don't know what it is yet. My lawyer is getting a copy by end of day. A pause. Whatever it is, it's possible that someone in my building has been reporting to him, watching me and reporting. She paused. I need you to know that the one person I am certain is not doing that is you. He looked at her. I've had more than one reason to test that certainty, she said, in small ways, leaving information accessible, watching to see if it moved. She finally looked at him. It never moved. He thought about the things he'd overheard and reported to her, the things he'd overheard and kept, the careful line between those two piles, which he'd maintained without being asked, because it was the line that a person with any self-respect maintained regardless of who was paying them. I told you at the beginning, he said, I know what you're trusting me with. I know you did. She held his gaze. I needed you to know that I know it wasn't just words. She went inside. He sat in the car for a moment, thinking about the documentation Fletcher had submitted and what it might contain, and the specific ugliness of someone surveilling a person's health and building a legal argument out of it. Then his phone rang. Mara's school. He picked up immediately. the reflex of a parent who had learned to pick up immediately from school numbers. And the woman on the other end said, "Mr. Pierce, this is Mrs. Delgado, the school nurse. Mara's fine. I want to say that first. She's fine. But she had a dizzy spell at recess, and I think you should come pick her up." He was already calculating the drive. "I'm on my way." Mara was sitting in the nurse's office on a cot with a juice box and her coat in her lap when he got there, looking slightly pale and completely alert and slightly annoyed in the specific way of a child who had been made to sit still when she didn't feel she needed to. She looked up when he came in and said, "I didn't fall or anything. I just felt weird." He sat down next to her. "Weird how?" "Spinny." She made a gesture with her hand that was meant to describe the sensation. For like a minute, and then it stopped. He looked at the nurse, who gave him the measured look of someone who has assessed 100 children and knew how to parse genuine concern from overcaution. "Her color's good, and her blood pressure's normal," the nurse said. "I think she may have been running around more than usual in the heat. But given her history—" "Yeah," Landon said. "I'll call the specialist." He called from the car while Mara sat in the back seat finishing her juice box and telling him about the field they'd been running in and the specific game she'd been playing that required a lot of spinning. He got the on-call line. The on-call doctor asked 8 questions, listened to the answers, and said, "It doesn't sound like a cardiac event. It sounds like a 7-year-old who was spinning in the sun. But bring her in tomorrow morning and we'll put her on the monitor for an hour just to be sure." He booked the appointment. He drove Mara home and made her lie on the couch with a popsicle and a pillow and put on her cooking competition show, and she fell asleep in 30 minutes, which probably told him more than anything else about how the afternoon had taken it out of her. He sat in the chair across from the couch and watched her sleep and thought about the on-call doctor's voice. Steady, unconcerned, probably right, and tried to sit inside that probability rather than the other one. His phone buzzed. Natalie. He stepped into the kitchen to answer. "Yeah." "Fletcher's documentation." Her voice was tight. "I have it. It's a series of reports from my building's head of security, a man named Gould who has apparently been submitting weekly summaries to Fletcher for 4 months. Observation logs. My schedule, flag deviations, once a note about a morning when I arrived 40 minutes late and appeared, this is the exact language, visibly depleted." A pause. "That was the morning after my cardiologist adjusted my medication, and the dosage made me nauseous for 3 days. Landon leaned against the kitchen counter. That's what he built the argument on. One late morning. Among other things, there are 8 reports total. Her voice had gone cold in the specific way that was not fury, but was what came before fury in a person who processed things in order. My lawyer says the reports don't constitute a legal basis for removal, but they constitute, in his words, a compelling narrative for someone who wants to create a picture. What are you doing about Gould? He's been walked out of the building. My lawyer is reviewing the terms of his employment for breach. A pause. That's not the problem that concerns me most right now. Fletcher's next move. He knew the vote wouldn't carry today. This was positioning. He's building a record. She paused. 3 weeks to the signing. If I get to the signing and close it clean, his record becomes irrelevant because the acquisition success speaks louder than anything he's documented. And if something goes wrong in the next 3 weeks, then his record is the story, and I'm the narrative he's been building for a year. She exhaled. I need these 3 weeks to go perfectly, Landon. It was the first time she'd used his first name. Neither of them acknowledged it. I know, he said. I need nothing to go wrong. I need to be visible, functional, decisive, and completely... She stopped. I need the patch to cooperate and my heart rate to stay manageable, and I need to sleep more than I've been sleeping, and I need Fletcher to not find one more thing to add to his file. She said it in a rush that was the closest thing to uncontrolled he'd ever heard from her. Not panicking, but close to the edge of the composure she kept so carefully maintained, close enough that he could hear the effort of maintaining it. Okay, he said. Okay, what? Okay, we do 3 weeks. He kept his voice level. You sleep. I'll move the schedule around so you're not doing early mornings back to back. The Callum Park conversation, do that this week while the board vote is still fresh and he's still feeling like your advocate. Let Claire manage the external optics. That's what she's good at. He paused. And call Dr. Foss tomorrow and tell her you need the medication stabilized before the signing. Whatever she needs to adjust it now while there's still time. Silence. You've been thinking about this too, she said. The same thing she'd said on the bridge, but this time it was different. Not observation, more like something being recognized for the first time. Someone has to, he said. You're too close to it. I'm the CEO, which is why you're too close to it. Another silence. From the living room, he could hear the specific sound of Mara's breathing shifted in sleep, the slow, even rhythm of a child who had spun in the sun and run too hard and earned her rest. He stood in the kitchen in his good jacket and listened to it. How is Mara? Natalie asked. The shift was abrupt but not jarring, the question of someone who had remembered something and asked it directly instead of building up to it. She had a dizzy spell at school. I just got back. A pause. Is she, she's fine. Probably ran too hard. We have a check-in tomorrow to be sure. He looked at the living room doorway. She's asleep on the couch. A longer pause. Something moved through the line that wasn't a word. Go be with her, Natalie said. We can talk tomorrow. You sure? The next 3 weeks start tomorrow. Tonight? She stopped. Tonight go sit with your kid. He looked at the living room. Mara had pulled her coat over her like a blanket in her sleep, which she did sometimes, the specific comfort of the familiar weight of it. Yeah, he said. Okay. Good night, Landon. Good night. He hung up and set his phone on the counter and went and sat in the chair across from the couch and watched his daughter breathe in the thin light of the apartment, and the city did its thing outside the windows, and the next 3 weeks were somewhere ahead of them, in the particular dark that exists just before the thing you've been building toward finally arrives. He sat. He watched her. He let the evening be what it was. You said, Part 5, Louis. Viết 6.500 từ liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, phá hội thoại tạo thành một câu liên mạch khi ghép lại. Part 5, lưu ý. Viết 6.000 đến 6.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, phá hội thoại tạo thành một câu liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện uyển ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ. Phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, có quan điểm cá nhân, thông điệp, bài học, góc nhìn con người. Nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chỉ dần bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more, 10 giờ 37 phút, Claude responded. The 3 weeks before the signing were the longest and the shortest of Landon's life, which he understood was a contradiction and was also exactly accurate. The 3 weeks before the signing were the longest and the shortest of Landon's life, which he understood was a contradiction and was also exactly accurate. Each day had the particular density of days when something significant is approaching, and everything you do either serves that approach or threatens it, and there is no neutral ground. He drove. He watched. He moved things around and stayed out of the way, and was present in the specific manner that had become, without either of them designing it, the operating mode of the strange and functional arrangement he and Natalie had built over 9 weeks from nothing. He rescheduled her mornings so she had 2 consecutive days with no call before 8:30. He reminded her, not asked, reminded in the tone of someone who had earned that standing, to eat before the Callum Park breakfast meeting on the Monday of the first week. She ate. The meeting lasted 90 minutes, and she came out with the particular set to her shoulders that meant something had gone well enough to trust. "He's in," she said, getting in the car. "Full support through the signing and the integration period. He'll chair the interim operational committee if I need reduced hours for any reason." She said the last part carefully, the same care she brought to anything that touched on the condition. Not hiding it, just precise about how much air she gave it. "That's the framework for after," Landon said. "That's the framework for after," she confirmed. She called Dr. Foss that afternoon. He heard fragments from the front seat, enough to know that the conversation was direct, and that whatever adjustment needed to be made to the medication was being made. She sounded, for the first time in weeks, like someone who had stopped trying to outrun a thing and had turned to look at it instead. The medication adjustment made her tired for 4 days. She didn't cancel anything, but she moved slower and her responses in the back seat had more space in them, and once on a Wednesday afternoon he pulled over outside a pharmacy and went in and came back with a bottle of electrolyte water, because she'd looked gray in the rear view and hadn't eaten since morning, and she'd taken it without arguing, which told him how tired she actually was. "You know," she said on the third day of the adjustment, "I've had 4 personal assistants in 9 years. None of them ever went into a pharmacy for me. They probably didn't know what they were looking for. No, they knew what was in my calendar." She drank the water. "That was the job." He pulled back into traffic. "What did you think the job was when you hired me?" She was quiet for a moment. "I thought I was hiring someone who would stay in the lane I defined and do the specific tasks I outlined and not ask questions that went beyond that scope." "You got something different." "Yes." A pause. "I'm aware that I should probably have had a problem with that." "But you didn't." "I didn't." She looked out the window at the city sliding past. "I think I'd forgotten what it was like to have someone nearby who was actually paying attention, not to my schedule, to the rest of it." She said it with the restraint of someone choosing words carefully, not to underplay but to not overstate. "Most people around me are very good at their jobs and very careful about what they notice. Careful meaning they notice and don't say. Careful meaning they notice and file it away for later use." She let that sit for a second. "You noticed things and told me, or noticed things and didn't, because you'd worked out which category they fell into." She paused. "That's rarer than it sounds." He drove. The afternoon light was long and the city was doing its late-day thing, everyone moving toward wherever they were going next. "The people who file things away," he said. "Was Fletcher one of them, before all this?" "Fletcher was one of the first investors," she said. "He came in when I was 24 and had a pitch deck and no track record, and he wrote the check anyway." A pause. "I think, for a long time, he believed the company was partly his. Not legally, emotionally." Another pause. "When it became clear that it wasn't, that I'd built something that didn't need him in the way he'd imagined, that's when the other things started." "Power," Landon said. "Expectation," she said, "which is power's quieter cousin." She closed her portfolio and set it on the seat beside her. "The hardest part is that I understand it. I understand why he did what he did. That doesn't make it acceptable. It just makes it human." He thought about that for the rest of the drive. The signing was on a Thursday. Landon drove her to the Harmont building at 8:15 in the morning. She was in the dark suit she'd worn to her first board meeting after he'd started, the one that he'd privately clocked as her working armor, the one that said, "I have been doing this for 9 years and you will not find a crack today." She had her portfolio and her phone and a coffee she'd actually made herself that morning at the East Side building, which she'd started doing occasionally now that the medication had stabilized. Small domestic normalcies re-emerging as the constant emergency began to recede. She didn't say much on the drive. He didn't push. The silence had the quality of someone who had prepared as completely as preparation allowed and was now in the period of simply being ready. At the Harmont drop-off circle, she got out and then paused with her hand on the door, which she sometimes did when something needed to be said, and she was finding the right form for it. "Whatever happens in there," she said. "You've done the work," he said. "Go close it." She looked at him for a moment, then she went in. He parked in the structure and read for an hour and stopped reading and just sat for a while, thinking about 9 weeks and wrong doors and everything that falls out of a single accidental moment when you're not paying attention to how consequential it is. He thought about the version of himself who'd almost marked that delivery undeliverable and gone home. He thought about the gap between that version and this one and how it had been crossed not by any single dramatic choice, but by a series of small ones. The decision to go up the stairs, the decision to tell the truth in a conference room on a Saturday morning, the decision to stay when staying was complicated. He thought about Mara, whose follow-up that morning had been the clearest yet. The cardiologist had used the phrase normal cardiac function, not trending toward, not we hope, but normal. He'd held it together in the office and then cried briefly and efficiently in the stairwell between the third and second floor before going back to his car, which felt like the appropriate amount of falling apart for a Thursday morning. She was at school right now, probably doing fractions or arguing about crackers at lunch, or running in the field in the particular way that had given him gray hairs in October and was now apparently just a 7-year-old running in a field. He was glad to let it be that. His phone buzzed at 11:43. Claire Voss's number. He picked up. "Mr. Pierce?" Her voice had something in it that wasn't her usual professional register. "Ms. Ashford has asked me to let you know that the signing concluded at 11:20. She'll be ready for pickup in approximately 40 minutes. He closed his book. "Is she okay?" A pause. Yes, she's okay." Another pause, and Claire Voss, who in 9 weeks had maintained a tone of precise professional neutrality in every communication, said, "I think she's very okay, actually. She'd like the long route home, if that's all right with you." "I know the route," he said. But she came out at 12:30, alone, without her portfolio for the first time. She'd left it inside, apparently, which struck him as meaningful in a way he couldn't precisely articulate. She looked like someone who had been in a room where something finished that was supposed to finish and had walked back out into regular air and was recalibrating to it. She got in. He pulled out. She sat in the back seat and did nothing. No phone, no portfolio, no tablet. She looked out the window at the city going past, and he took the long route, out toward the waterfront, along the Bay Road that added 20 minutes and had the water on one side and the old industrial district on the other, and very little traffic midday. And neither of them said anything for a long time. "It's done," she said finally. Not triumphant, just factual. "How were the terms?" "Exactly where we needed them." She paused. Denise Harmon shook my hand at the end and said, "I've watched a lot of these go sideways in the final weeks. This one didn't. That was you." She said it with the quietness of someone who wasn't sure yet how to receive a compliment that was completely accurate. I told her it wasn't only me. He drove. "Fletcher was there," she said. "He came as a board observer, his right." A pause. "He sat through the whole thing. When it was done, he came up to me and shook my hand and said congratulations, and I looked at him and I thought about everything he'd done over the past year, all of it, and I shook his hand and said thank you and meant neither word of it." She exhaled. "But I said it because that's what you do." "How did it feel?" "Terrible." A beat. "And also fine. The way things that are necessary feel terrible and fine at the same time." She looked at the water. "His position on the board is still his position. I can't remove him and I wouldn't try. But what he tried to build is gone. The narrative he was constructing, it's irrelevant now. The acquisition is done, the terms are solid, Callum Park is running the integration committee. There's nothing left to undermine." "He'll find something else eventually," Landon said. "Probably." She didn't say it with resignation. She said it with the acceptance of someone who has decided that the existence of ongoing difficulty is not a reason to stop building. But not today. He drove along the Bay Road. The water was gray-green in the midday light, the kind of color that made you understand why people moved to cities on water and stayed. A container ship was moving slowly across the middle distance, impossibly large and impossibly slow. "I called Dr. Foss this morning," Natalie said, "before the signing. He glanced in the rear view. And? We scheduled the procedure." She said it the way you say a thing you've been avoiding saying for so long that actually saying it produces a sensation close to dizziness. 8 weeks from Monday. She had a cancellation. A pause. She said she was glad I called. She said that in a way that communicated she'd been waiting for me to call for a while. She has been. I know. She was quiet for a moment. 6 to 8 weeks of recovery. Callum's committee covers the operational side. Priya's been given an expanded role as of this morning. I sent the announcement before I went into the signing room. She paused. Claire cried a little. She's been worried about Priya being underused for 2 years and never said anything directly. She said it by not saying it. Exactly. She almost smiled. I have good people. I forget sometimes how good. She looked at the water. I think I've been so focused on what could be taken from me that I stopped noticing what was actually there. Landon thought about the permanence of that particular tunnel, the one where loss feels more real than what you still have, where the monitoring of threat crowds out the acknowledgement of ground. He'd lived in that tunnel after Mara's mother left, after the nursing program fell through, after the job that was supposed to be the transition out of delivery work evaporated. He knew its topography. It's hard to see what's there when you're managing what might be taken, he said. That's not a character flaw. That's just where fear puts your eyes. Natalie looked at the back of his head. He could feel it. Is that something you figured out about yourself? She asked. Eventually, he said. It took longer than it should have. She was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about what comes after the recovery, she said. Not the company stuff. The other after. She said it carefully, the way she always said things that were close to the private center of her. I've been running at this pace for so long that I'm not sure I know what I'm like when I'm not running. You'll find out. That's either reassuring or terrifying. Probably both, he said, like most things. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and was not quite agreement and was essentially both. He drove the rest of the Bay Road in the good silence that had become, over 9 weeks, one of the more reliable things in his daily life. And then he turned back into the city and drove her home. 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, Natalie called him from her personal number. He picked up at the third ring, coffee in hand, Mara still asleep in the next room. Yeah. I have something I want to run by you. Her voice had the Saturday quality he'd started recognizing, slightly less armored than the weekday voice. The professional register dialed back 1 notch. It's not a driving thing. Okay. I've been restructuring the executive team to support the integration period and the time I'll be out. She paused. There's a position that doesn't have a clean title yet because I've been building it around the function rather than the label. Operational liaison for the integration process. It's not a driving job. It's the thing you've been doing for 9 weeks, formalized. Being present, watching the room, telling me what I'm missing because I'm too close to it, managing the things that fall in the gaps between the official roles. A pause. With an actual salary and benefits and a title that doesn't say driver. Landon set down his coffee. It's a real job, she said, into his silence. This isn't charity. The function is real, and the company needs someone doing it, and you've already demonstrated that you can do it. Another pause. I also want you to know that it exists independently of whatever else this is, the arrangement we have. It would exist on its own merits even if we'd never met the way we did. What does it pay? He said. She told him. He was quiet for a long moment. It was more than 3 times what the delivery work had paid. It was more than enough for Mara's appointments and Mrs. Okafor's rates, and the tire on the Civic and the defroster, and then more beyond that. The more beyond that being the distance between having enough and having some room. I'd need time to train up, he said. On the corporate side, the terminology. I know, Claire will help. Priya will help. The learning curve is real, but it's manageable. She paused. You're not starting from zero. You understand how the company actually works better than some people who've been here for years. I'd still need the flexibility for Mara. That's built into the arrangement, non-negotiable from my side, not just yours. He looked at the kitchen wall. The permission slip from last week's field trip was still stuck to the refrigerator with a fruit-shaped magnet. Mara's drawing of what she'd seen on the trip was taped below it. A field, a bus, some trees that were more enthusiastic than accurate. He thought about the version of himself on a rainy evening in October, looking at a delivery route that paid $180 and almost skipping it. About how the distance between that moment and this one had been covered not by any grand event, but by the unglamorous accumulation of showing up, doing the thing, staying in the room when the room was difficult. He thought about Natalie pressing her hand to her chest in traffic, about a woman who had built something significant entirely alone and was just now, possibly for the first time, allowing the possibility that alone was not the only way to operate. "Yeah," he said. "I'll take it." He heard her exhale, Kyo, brief, small, the exhale of someone who had been holding something and let it go. "Good," she said. "I'll have Claire send the paperwork Monday." "Okay." A pause. Then she said, "Landon." "Yeah. Thank you." She said it with none of the professional formality of the earlier thank yous, not the transactional gratitude of someone acknowledging a service rendered. She said it the way a person says thank you when they mean something larger than the word itself can hold, when they're using it to carry the weight of everything they can't fully articulate. For the whole thing, from the beginning. He thought about what to say to that, and decided that most of what could be said was probably already known. "Get through the surgery, okay?" he said. "That's the thank you I want." A long pause, then quietly, "I will." The surgery was on a Monday 8 weeks later at a private hospital on the city's north side. Landon drove her there at 6 in the morning. She was quiet on the way, not the working quiet and not the tired quiet, but a particular kind of stillness he hadn't encountered from her before. The stillness of someone who has made a decision they've been postponing for a long time and is now on the far side of the decision, moving toward it, and has put down the argument that used to run in the background. He pulled into the hospital's private entrance and stopped the car. She didn't get out immediately. She sat for a moment, hands in her lap, looking at the entrance. "I don't do well with waiting," she said. "I never have. And now I have 6 to 8 weeks of it." "You're not waiting," he said. "You're recovering. Those are different things." She looked at him in the rearview mirror. "Waiting is when nothing's happening," he said. "Recovering is when everything's happening. It just doesn't look like much from the outside." She held his gaze in the mirror for a moment. Then she looked at the door again. "Priya is handling the Monday board update. Claire has the external communications. Callum is running the integration committee meeting Thursday." She said them like items she was checking one by one, setting them down. "Everything is covered." "It is." "I know it is. I just needed to say it." She picked up her bag. "Dr. Foss says the procedure takes 4 hours. She says the recovery room is 2 more. She says the prognosis for full resumption of normal activity is..." She stopped. "She says good. She says actually good, not clinical language good. That's what matters." She opened the door. The morning air came in, cool, the city not yet fully awake, the sky doing the thing it did just before full daylight, when everything was the same soft gray blue. She stood by the car for a moment. "Mara," she said, "she's okay?" Her last appointment was the best one yet. The cardiologist used the word unremarkable, which, in that context, is the best possible word. Natalie smiled. It was unguarded in a way her smiles rarely were. Not the controlled expression she deployed in professional rooms, not the small contained version that broke through when something amused her, but a real one, reaching her eyes, changing her whole face. "Unremarkable," she said. "I love that." "Me too." She looked at him one more time. "I'll call you when I'm out." "I'll be here." She went through the door. He sat in the car for a while after she disappeared inside. The hospital entrance was quiet. One orderly crossing the parking area, a nurse arriving for the morning shift, the slow, ordinary traffic of a place that ran at all hours and didn't pause for any single thing happening inside it. He watched it and thought about the 9 weeks that had started with a storm and a door that wasn't latched and had somehow arrived here. At a Monday morning outside a hospital where a woman he'd met by complete accident was doing the thing she'd needed to do for years and had finally allowed herself to do. There was a version of the world where he'd marked that delivery undeliverable, where the $180 wasn't worth the unfamiliar address and the late hour and the rain. He'd thought about that version many times, Not with relief exactly, but with the particular attention that you bring to a narrow near miss when you understand retroactively how narrow it was. He didn't believe things happened for reasons. He'd never found that idea very convincing, what he believed. What 9 weeks and 32 years and a daughter with a structurally irregular heart that had normalized itself against statistical probability had taught him was that things happened, and what mattered was what you did with them when they did. The door had swung open because a house was old and a frame was warped, and a man named Gerald had a phone call at the wrong moment. None of that was destiny. All of it was just circumstance, ordinary and indifferent. What you did with it, that was the part that was yours. He drove to Mara's school, dropped her off, watched her go up the steps, came back downtown. He spent the day at a desk in the Ashford Capitol building for the first time. Not in the lobby, not in a parking structure, but at an actual desk in a small office 2 doors down from Claire's that had been cleared out and assigned to him at the start of the week. He was reviewing integration documents that Priya had marked for his attention, trying to build the vocabulary for what he already understood in substance when Claire knocked on the open door at 3:15. Dr. Foss's office called, she said. Her face told him before the words did. The procedure went well. She's in recovery. Dr. Foss said to tell you, she looked at her notepad. She said to tell you exactly this. Tell her people it went textbook, and she'll be back to running everyone's lives in 5 weeks, probably 4. Claire looked up. She said her people. I think she meant you. He set down the document. Thank you. Claire looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who had worked for Natalie Ashford for 6 years and had watched the arrangement of the past 9 weeks from a specific vantage point and had formed a view about it that she kept professionally to herself. She's lucky, Claire said simply, that you went up those stairs. She went back to her desk. Landon sat in the small office and looked out the window at the city below and let himself feel, briefly and without trying to manage it, the particular texture of this moment, the relief of it, the strangeness of it, the way it sat inside him alongside everything else that had happened and was still happening. Mara's unremarkable heart, the integration documents on the desk, the signed contract in the filing cabinet, the woman 4 miles north who was breathing steadily in a recovery room past the worst of the things she'd been carrying. It wasn't a neat resolution. He knew that. The world didn't resolve neatly. Fletcher was still on the board. The integration period was still months of work. His own learning curve in this role was genuinely steep, and Natalie's recovery would have bad days in it alongside the good ones because recoveries always did. Mara would have more appointments. The Civic still needed the defroster fixed. Life remained as it always had, substantially composed of things that were only partially solved and required continued attention. But there was something here that hadn't been here before, something that had been assembled imperfectly and without a blueprint from the materials available. A delivery driver who noticed things and a billionaire who needed someone to notice, and the 9 weeks of small decisions and difficult mornings and long drives and necessary conversations that had built, one piece at a time, something neither of them had set out to build. 4 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, Landon was in a board meeting for the first time. Not as staff, not standing at a wall, but seated at the table in his designated role, with a notepad and a title on the agenda that still felt slightly foreign but was becoming less so. Natalie was not there. She was at home, in the 4th week of recovery, working reduced hours that she was managing to stretch to full hours by 10 a.m. every morning, but had agreed, after direct pressure from Dr. Foss and indirect pressure from Landon, to at least start it reduced. Callum Park was running the meeting. He ran it well, concise, directive, with the practiced authority of someone who had sat on enough boards to know exactly how much air each item needed. Fletcher was present. He'd been present at every meeting since the signing, occupying his board position with the particular dignity of a man who had lost a campaign and had decided that the correct posture was to act as though the campaign had never happened. He was professional. He contributed where his expertise was relevant. He did not in 4 weeks attempt another move. Landon watched him through the meeting with the same quality of attention he'd once used to watch him work a cocktail party, and what he saw now was a man who had been reduced not by defeat, but by the thing that always reduces people who build their position on the vulnerability of others. The vulnerable person hadn't broken. The foundation of the campaign had simply not been there, and without it, Fletcher was just a board member with a significant position in a company that was performing well, which was a perfectly fine thing to be and contained no power over anyone. After the meeting, walking out through the lobby, Callum Park fell into step beside Landon. "She told me about you, Tom," Park said. "Before the shareholders' event. She said she had someone she trusted completely who wasn't on anyone's radar." He looked at Landon with the direct assessment of a man who had made his career evaluating people. "I thought she was being hyperbolic." "She wasn't." "No." Park nodded. "She wasn't." He paused at the lobby door. "This role you're in, it's going to evolve. The company's going to need what you do in a more formalized way as the integration matures." He said it with the tone of someone making an observation, not a promise. "I'd think about your trajectory, if I were you." Landon held the door. "I'm thinking about it." Park went out. Landon stood for a moment in the lobby and then went back to his office. On the evening that Natalie returned to full office hours, 5 weeks and 2 days after the surgery, 1 week ahead of the conservative estimate, Landon was in the parking structure at 7:45 a.m., with the car ready because some things didn't change and didn't need to. She came through the private elevator at 7:58. She was in the charcoal blazer over a dark shirt, the monitoring patch gone from beneath her blouse for the first time. Dr. Foss had cleared its removal the previous Friday, which had been a brief, unreported moment in a doctor's office that had mattered more than any board meeting. She looked rested. Not perfectly rested, not untouched by 5 weeks of difficult recovery and the anxiety of distance from the work she'd built, but genuinely rested in a way he hadn't seen from her in the entire time he'd known her. She got in the car. He looked at her in the rear view. "How do you feel?" She settled in and looked out the window at the parking structure and then at the rectangle of morning sky visible at the top of the ramp. "Like myself," she said. "Maybe more like myself than I have in a few years." He nodded. He pulled out of the structure and up the ramp and into the city morning, which was doing its Thursday things. The same delivery trucks and school buses and people moving toward wherever they were going that it always was. And he drove. "I've been thinking," she said after a while. "About?" "The wrong door." She said it with a quality in her voice that was different from how she'd referred to it in the past, when she'd referred to it at all, which had been rarely and carefully. "I've thought about it as the embarrassing thing for a long time. The violation, even though it was accidental, the threat." She paused. "And lately, I've been thinking about it differently." "How so?" "Oh, I've been thinking that I spent a lot of years making sure every door in my life was locked, and the right people had the right access, and nothing happened that I didn't control." She looked at the city going past. "And the thing that actually changed my life was a door that was warped, and a man who knocked, and it swung open before it was supposed to." She paused. "I don't know what to do with that philosophically, but I think about it." He drove. "I almost didn't go up the stairs," he said. She looked at the back of his head. "What?" "That night. Gerald went to take a call and you were on the 2nd floor and the delivery slip said 2nd floor, 3rd door. I stood in the entrance hall and I almost just waited for Gerald to come back." He paused. "The $180 surcharge is the only reason I went up." She was very quiet for a moment. $180. It was a good week." She made a sound that was fully a laugh this time. Not controlled, not brief, but a genuine laugh that lasted a few seconds and had surprise in it. The surprise of something that strikes you as both absurd and completely right. $180, she said again. Mara needed the copay. She laughed again, quieter. Then she was quiet, in the good way. He drove toward the Ashford Capitol building through the Thursday morning, past the bakery on Clement Street where he'd stopped that first week, and which had since become a regular detour, past the bridge turnoff that led to the Long Bay route they'd taken the day of the signing, through the financial district coming to life around them with its particular Thursday energy. At the drop-off circle, he stopped and she got out and paused with her hand on the door, the way she sometimes did. Not looking for words this time, just pausing, taking a second before the day started. She looked at him. "I'll be late tonight. Board dinner?" "I know. Claire sent the time." "Okay." She looked at the building and then back at him. "Landon." "Yeah." The job that I offered you, she said. The one that doesn't have a clean title yet. I'm doing the job. I know, but I've been thinking about the title. She looked at him steadily. I want to call it what it actually is. Not liaison, not coordinator, not any of those words that describe proximity to the work without describing the work. She paused. I want to call it something that acknowledges that the role exists because I needed someone to see the things I was too close to see and to tell me the truth when telling me the truth was harder than not telling me. He waited. Advisor, she said. Senior Executive Advisor to the CEO. A pause. The CEO that you've been advising for 9 weeks, whether or not anyone called it that. He held her gaze. He thought about the contract on the Saturday morning and the folded sheet of paper he still had in a drawer somewhere, and the 9 weeks between then and here. Yeah, he said. That works. She nodded once. Then she went up the steps and through the door, and he watched her go. The stride of someone who had come back to something they'd built and was about to resume building it, changed in the specific ways that matter, carrying less of the weight that had never needed to be carried alone. He sat in the car for a moment. The city moved around him. He thought about what it meant, the whole arc of it, from a rainy evening and a high-paid delivery to a Thursday morning outside a building where he now had a desk and a title and a function that was genuine and visible. He thought about the things he'd believed for a long time that this year had gently disassembled. The belief that his life was a fixed shape and the shape was small, that the opportunities that mattered were the ones that arrived looking like opportunities and not like a wrong door in a stranger's house. He thought about how the most consequential things in his life had not announced themselves. Mara's birth, her mother leaving, the delivery route on a rainy night. None of them had come with a sign that said, "Pay attention, this one matters." They just happened, and what happened next depended on what you brought to them. What you brought to them. That was the whole thing, really. Not luck, not fate, not the story people told afterward about how things were meant to go. Just what you brought. The attention, the honesty, the willingness to be in the room and do the thing even when the thing was not the thing you thought you'd signed up for. He had brought what he had. She had brought what she had. And out of two broken and imperfect and frequently exhausted people navigating circumstances neither of them had chosen, something had been built that was real and solid, and this was the part he was still getting used to, not finished. That was the part worth sitting with. Not finished, still going. The kind of story that didn't end so much as open into something larger, which was the only kind of story that was worth anything in the end. He pulled out of the drop-off circle. He drove back through the city to collect his daughter from school, because it was his morning and he'd arranged it that way. And because Mara had told him the previous evening, very seriously, that he'd missed the field trip discussion at breakfast, and she needed to tell him about the butterfly she'd seen near the bus. A butterfly near the bus. He drove toward it,